Let me just discuss with you this uh, course plan. Okay, so this is basically, although the ecclesiastical office uh, calls this course Special Questions in Medieval Philosophy. When I teach a course in the history of philosophy, like for example in this case medieval philosophy, I more or less tackle, cover some grounds. What I mean by that is uh, I always take a historical and thematic approach in offering my classes or handling my classes, because I think the historical and the thematic is the best way to present the history of philosophy. I mean, in this case, in the history of medieval philosophy. So, although it is called Special Questions in Medieval Philosophy, I will be taking it as a course in the history of medieval philosophy. Okay. Uh, so, this course tackles important questions in medieval philosophy. It aims to introduce philosophy students to the special questions or topics on God, the world, knowledge, man, liberty, grace, evil, discussed in both the patristic and scholastic periods. So we are going to divide our this course into two. The first part will tackle the patristic era, patristic philosophy, philosophy of Saint Augustine, of Plotinus, and then scholastic philosophy, focusing more on the philosophy of Aquinas uh, and Albert the Great. But of course, I will be also discussing some of the Franciscan scholastics. Okay, so we divide this into two: patristic philosophy and scholastic philosophy. So at the end of the course, you are expected to know the thoughts, concepts of medieval philosophers regarding the mentioned topics. So we'll just be focusing on God, the world, though that's pretty much the whole thing that these medieval philosophers talk about. They focus on God, the world, knowledge, etc. So, and then now this is our outline. So my first lecture actually will be the first, the introduction part. Okay. Uh, so the first will be introduction, the scope of medieval philosophy, uh, Christianity and medieval philosophy, the characteristics of medieval philosophy, and then a very short overview of patristic and scholastic philosophy, and then the forerunners. I don't know if I can cover this whole thing, but let's see. No, and then we have patristic era. So we'll talk about the early medieval philosophy, uh, focusing more on the early fathers of the church, especially Boethius and Dionysius the Areopagite. Right. So, and then the main focus of our discussion in medieval or in patristic philosophy would be the philosophy of Saint Augustine, okay? Because we know that uh, one of the main central figures in medieval philosophy is Saint Augustine. And then much of our time will be devoted to scholasticism. Right? So we'll discuss the formation of scholasticism. I actually divide scholasticism into three historical parts or historical periods. You have the early formation of scholasticism, okay, and then the golden age of scholasticism, which features the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and the decline of the scholastic era or scholastic philosophy. So, under the formation of scholasticism, this will not be a very detailed discussion, but I just want to highlight the contributions of certain philosophers that ushered in the transition from the Neoplatonic or patristic era transition from Aristotelianism, no, to the uh, formation of scholastic philosophy. Okay, so I will be mentioning some thinkers here, especially Alcuin, uh, one of those commissioned by Charlemagne, King of France, in 800 to establish the Palace School, okay, the Palatine School. So we call that the Carolinian Renaissance. And then, of course, this thinker, John Scotus Erigena. And then we'll be mentioning some of the Arab and Jewish philosophers. So this will not be, again, this will not be a very detailed discussion of the philosophies, just highlights the contribution to uh, scholastic philosophy, Al-Farabi, Avicenna, Algazel, Averroes, Maimonides. And then you have the early scholastics like William of Champoux, Peter Abelard, Saint Anselm. One particular focus of discussion will be the problem of the universals. Okay, so again, we'll just be highlighting some of their, especially their contribution to the debate on the problem of the universals. Okay, so, and then you have the golden age of scholasticism. So the rise of the university and the mendicant orders, and by mendicant we divide that into two. You have the Franciscans and the Dominicans. Well, of course, when we hear scholastic philosophy or even medieval philosophy, automatically we associate that particular age or period with the Dominicans, particularly Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas. Uh, while we are in a Dominican institution and we love St. Thomas, we should also recognize the contribution of the Franciscans, because, well, uh, they also have a significant contribution to the development of the scholastic thought, especially these three philosophers, Alexander of Hales, Roger Bacon, and Saint Bonaventure. Alexander of Hales particularly because he was one of the earlier influences of Saint Thomas Aquinas. Okay? The first master that Saint Thomas recognized, aside from, of course, Saint Albert the Great, was Alexander of Hales. Right? So that's very important. And then, of course, we cannot discount the fact that Saint Bonaventure, friendly rival of Saint Thomas Aquinas, pretty much engaged Saint Thomas in many disputation, Saint Bonaventure. So if Saint Thomas Aquinas is the angelic doctor, Saint Bonaventure is the seraphic doctor. Okay, and of course, so yes, we're going to highlight the philosophy of Saint Thomas Aquinas, but I think we have to give due, due attention to the Franciscans because they have contributed significantly to the development of scholastic philosophy. Okay. Then, of course, we'll focus on these two great Dominican saints, Saint Albert the Great and Saint Thomas Aquinas. Now, to complete this discussion on scholasticism, we'll be focusing on the two other groups of philosophers. I just call them the other scholastics. John Scotus and Siger of Brabant. Okay, and Saint Thomas left the University of Paris. One of those who succeeded him is Siger of Brabant. Okay, and then of course after this golden age of scholasticism with Saint Thomas Aquinas, there was a period of decline. Well, we call this a period of decline because right after Saint Thomas, of course, if Saint Thomas is the highest point of scholastic philosophy, there is now a lessening of influence of the scholastic philosophy. But we cannot discount the contribution of these thinkers like William of Ockham and Meister Eckhart and course, Nicolas of Cusa. So these are very important figures in the history of medieval philosophy. While we will be focusing on the masters, the key figures like uh, uh, Boethius, Augustine. Oh, by the way, I failed to mention Plotinus, no? Augustine, and then Alexander of Hales, Bonaventure, Albert the Great, and Saint Thomas Aquinas. Let's not forget the contribution of the other philosophers. Well, when you look at the coverage, it's a very ambitious coverage. It's very extensive, but the purpose here is to show that there are other thinkers. Let's not be misled into thinking that medieval philosophy or scholastic philosophy is all about Saint Thomas Aquinas, because that is not true. Okay. Well, we recognize Saint Thomas to be the prince of the scholastics, but there are many other thinkers who contributed to the philosophy of the medieval period. So it's a way of introducing to you these names, these figures, and a way of having a kind of bigger view perspective of medieval philosophy. Of course, nowadays the focus is no longer on medieval philosophy. Many philosophy students, they focus more on the contemporary philosophical traditions, like critical theory, hermeneutics, deconstruction, postmodernism, um, existentialism, phenomenology, and the many other contemporary philosophies. But let us not forget that historically, these philosophies, although they have already sort of ignored this part of the history of Western philosophy, they cannot deny the fact that these thinkers contributed a lot to the development of Western philosophy. And any serious scholar of the history of Western philosophy or philosophy in general cannot just ignore these thinkers, whether they like it or not. Right? Of course, some people would say it's no longer quite, these people are no longer relevant in the contemporary philosophical discussion, but they are still relevant for me, especially personally. Uh, the modern thinkers, the modern philosophers have dismissed them already. In fact, even calling them medieval, and you know that medieval is a pejorative term. It's not a good term. No? It does not connote something that is very positive. No? So, but we cannot just dismiss them, and we cannot just critique them or criticize them without fully understanding their philosophies. I always tell my students, especially those who dismiss Thomism, or medieval philosophy as rather no longer relevant to our age and are very critical of these philosophies, I tell them, you cannot criticize a philosophy which you don't understand. You cannot say bad things about these philosophies if you don't study them. So you don't have a right to say that the house is no good if you have only seen the roof of the house or the facade of the house. I tell them, you want to criticize the house, enter the house and see what is inside. And that's only the time when you can say, well, that house is no good. But if you have just seen the roof, don't criticize. No. Okay. Anyway, so here are some listed references. I actually have these references when it was not yet pandemic. So these are normally the materials, the general references that I require my students to at least read, make that as a reference. So here are some of these books. Probably are familiar with Copplestone, of course, and then Etienne Gilson. Well, some familiar uh, uh, Thonard. So these are actually the three very important secondary sources in medieval philosophy: Thonard, Copplestone, Gilson, and the rest. Well, these are some of them are rather new sources. Okay, now let's go to the requirements. So, of course, the first one is reading of the assigned text and oral report, online oral report. This is what I usually do for this online classes. And then summary papers on readings, assigned readings, and then quizzes and prelim examination and a final paper. So this is normally what I do. I discuss all the topics, okay, and then uh, after I have covered the topics that I need to lecture on, you will do your oral report. For your oral report, you will be choosing a particular topic, okay, particular topic that no from the given topics in the outline, and you will be given say 30 minutes to report, right? And then another thing here, the summary papers on readings. Normally, I would assign, say, three philosophers from the lineup, and you will focus on one particular work, not necessarily the entire work, because, for example, what about the Summa Contra Gentiles? No? But just a portion of their work, and you're going to do a summary. No? So that means reading the primary text, let us say what Article 10 of the Summa, do a summary papers on that, or let us say uh, uh, a chapter of Saint Augustine's The Confession, or a chapter of the City of God. So that would be the the summary papers. Okay, and then of course you have quizzes, and then the prelim exam. So all of this will be online, and then you have your final paper. So this will be the basis of your grade. The summary papers, 20%. Then you have the oral report, just 10%. And then I normally give two quizzes, so that would be 15-15. And then the prelim exam, and then that's not a final exam. That's actually a final paper. Okay, the final paper. So that makes up the. So how many papers you are going to submit to me? You're going to submit to me four papers. No, four papers. It means two summary papers, one oral report. So these are different topics. So that will you have to cover four topics. No, so two summary, one oral report, and then one final paper. Okay, and then you have uh, quizzes. Two quizzes. This will just be short quizzes, and then the prelim exam. The purpose of that is to at least give me some kind of an objective basis of my grades. No, the quizzes would be something objective. No, because the final paper, well, when you read, there is an element of being subjectivism in in grading papers. Okay, so that's how you will be graded. Okay, so that pretty much explain what are the expected output in this class. Okay, so any question, any concern about our course plan and the course requirements? Yes, Father Romel.
Doc, on the final paper, how many pages is it? And on the topic, can we choose our own
Ye
topic?
yes, you're going to choose your own topics, but what I do is I require my students to post in our messenger group that topics or the philosophers
Mhm.
you're going to work on, so that there will be no duplication. And then for the final paper, um, I don't know if a four or a 3,000 word paper is fine with you.
3,000 paper doc.
No, no, 3,000 words, Father.
3,000 words. Okay. I think
A
so.
3,000 word is, I
Uh,
think, just what, 6 pages?
that will be just fine for
Yeah, kasi a regular article in a journal would be 6,000 words. No? 6,000 words. So that's the 3,000 is the minimum. If you want to, to write a full blown paper, a journal article, for example, I would appreciate. I will actually encourage you to do that.
yes.
Incidentally, I am editing the Philosophia. I'm the editor in chief of Philosophia, and it's always my challenge to my students to write his final paper really seriously and be able to publish that in a journal. That's the for me. That's that's the would be a dream. It would be a dream requirement. When you're able to publish in a journal. So my when students ask, how will my paper, the file paper, be graded? My short answer is the way I review journal articles. The way I review journal articles. I mean, uh, you have to you have to cite your sources. One time, I'm going to show you the our what do you call this, the paper evaluation document in our journal. So you will see how journal articles are evaluated by blind referees, no? Because you are masteral students, right? So you have to write with the view of publishing your papers, no? So that's always a challenge, my challenge to my students. And last before the pandemic, I we organized the centenary of John Paul II in Cebu, conference on John Paul II. And at that time, I was handling a course on Carol Wojtyła, or John Paul II. And I encourage really my students to present paper in the conference. Their final paper should, if they want, they can present that in the conference. And I had two students who actually presented their paper in the conference, and one of them ended with their papers published in the commemorative issue of our journal. So that should be a goal, no, for you, no, to not necessarily in philosophia, but to any philosophy journal. Okay? So I hope I answered your question, Father Romel.
Thank you, doc.
Any other concerns, questions about the requirements, about our conduct of classes? Oh, by the way, I'm recording this class, and what I normally do is edit my lecture, and then share the edited version of my lecture to my students. Sometimes I upload that on my YouTube channel, uh, because it's also one way of sharing uh, one way of sharing. Okay, one way of sharing your knowledge. So some people may be interested in my lectures, so I just upload my lectures on YouTube. So if you want to listen again to the discussion, then it will be available for you. Okay. So any other concerns? Any other questions? No more. All right. So I will start with my first. Let me just. Oh, okay. I will share my. So I will share now my lecture. By the way, I have uploaded this in the course site, so you can just download this uh, handout. It's actually a handout. It's a handout for our discussion. Okay, so I'll start with this very short. I don't know how if this is short, but this is a short introduction to medieval philosophy, and this will just be an overview. Okay, so this is just an overview of medieval philosophy, the medieval world of Christianity. Okay, so before I start discussing this, I will have to go back to the history of Western philosophy. We know that the first um, period in the history of Western philosophy is the period of the Athenians or of the Greeks, Athenians in particular. So you have the Greek philosophers, and Greek philosophy can be conveniently divided into three sub-periods. You have the pre-Socratic philosophers, Thales, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Anaximenes, Anaxagoras, Democritus, etc. And then you have the um Socratic philosophers, uh, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And then, of course, the last would be the post-Socratic philosophers, the Epicureans, the Stoics, the Skeptics, and so on and so forth. So the ancient philosophers, they focus on the cosmos. Okay? They focus on the question about what is the fundamental principle or stuff that accounts for the permanency and stability of reality, and at the same time, what accounts for the changes, okay? For the different mutations, transformations that happen in the physical world. So they're looking for this basic stuff. Okay? Of course, as they search for the basic stuff that would account for the permanency and changes in reality, they were using their reason in order to discover these ultimate principles. Okay? So the logos. Before the logos, people relied more on stories, more on tales, on the myth or mythos. Okay, so before the pre-Socratics came, there were they relied more on the myth, the mythos, mythology. Then the pre-Socratic started to use their reason in order to explain reality. So there was a transition from mythos to logos. But what is the main focus of their logical investigation of the logos? Investigation about the nature of the world, what accounts for the permanency and for the changes in the world. But of course, little by little, there was a transformation or a transition rather from question about cosmology, about the world, to question about man, the essence of man, the conduct of man. And that's where, at that point, Socrates entered into the picture. And then, of course, this investigation about man transitioned into an investigation about society and politics, okay? How man gained knowledge, okay? How can we explain the nature of man or the soul of man, the immortality of the soul of man, and so on. So that's where uh, Plato entered into the picture. And of course, it would be Aristotle who would sort of tie up all these things into a comprehensive philosophy. So the focus of philosophy was not just on cosmology, it was not just on man, okay? It was really focused on everything. So Aristotle came up with a comprehensive system of philosophy, ranging from logic to metaphysics, ethics to epistemology, psychology to aesthetics, and so on and so forth. So it was a complete, sort of one of the most complete philosophies in the history of Western philosophy. That's the Greek. Okay, focus on the logos. Then, of course, if we're going to continue the historical progression of philosophy in medieval thought, well, we have to recognize also the contribution of the Romans, because the Romans served as a kind of transition from the Greek philosophy to Christian philosophy. Because we have to recognize that the Romans became a kind of vehicle in transforming the world from a Greek world to a Christian world. Of course, in between you have the Roman world. Okay, so you have the Greco-Roman, and then you have Christianity. Okay, at first, the Roman emperors were not just hostile; they persecuted the Christians. But eventually, well, Constantine became the first emperor to recognize Christianity, and that's it. Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. But of course, not just in terms of politics, that or militarily, that the Romans were instrumental in bringing Christianity into the picture. There were also Roman thinkers who served as a conduit between the Greek thought and the Christian thought. One example of this would be Boethius, who translated the works of Aristotle. So you have the Greek cosmological, and then you have the Romans, and then you have the Christians, the early Christians. Okay. Now, let's talk of early Christians in general. Well, they focus more on the theos. Okay. So at the end of the dominance, and this is where I now connect the Greek philosophy to Christianity. At the end of the dominance of Greek philosophy, we see the appearance of Christianity, which established itself in that part of the world, in the Western world, as the one true religion. Okay, so this one true religion is revealed by God and announced to men by the Son of God himself, Jesus Christ. Okay. Now, in terms of philosophy, the early Christians followed the philosophy of Plato, the Platonic philosophy. No? Uh, Plato's philosophy, well, of course, established the academy towards the end of the around 4th, 5th, and 4th century up to around 880 no, AD. But the academy was very instrumental in in bringing philosophy, Greek philosophy, to the early Christians. Okay, so the early Christian philosophy is primarily based on Platonic doctrines, and these Platonic doctrines complemented uh, with the divine revelation. Okay, so that's from the Christian perspective, the divine revelation, and interpreted reality as a creation of the divine being. So you see the difference between the Greek perspective, the cosmological perspective of the Greek. They were looking for the ultimate reality. Now, here comes the Christian saying that, well, reality is a divine creation. So the source of this reality would be the divine being. So during the early part of the Middle Ages, through the Christian thinkers who were mostly clerics, a theocentric understanding of reality prevailed in the Western world. So if in Greek philosophy, reality was understood in terms of logos, now reality is understood in terms of the theos, meaning the world is now understood in terms of the spiritual doctrines and principles that is based on the belief on a divine supreme being, a personal God who created the natural or physical world and predestined its course and governs it through the natural laws, which is actually based on the divine law. So you have the transition from, if you're going to trace back how thought developed from mythos to logos to theos, okay, to God, the theos. So uh, every aspect of life now under the medieval world, the early Christian world, the social, the moral, the political, they were all understood in the context of the spiritual. So the Greeks, cosmological, the Christians, especially the early Christians, they were more spiritual, based on divine revelation, based on the doctrines of the church. So now the end of life is eternal salvation into the next world. The Greeks never had that idea of, eternal salvation into the next world. Okay? But in the Christian world, we have this other world, okay? The world to come. And going into that world will require salvation. And this salvation is only possible through faith and grace that comes from its divine source, from God. Okay? So that's the character of the early Middle Middle Ages, philosophy of the early Middle Ages. So it's dominated by this idea of a divine being who created the world. It's a personal God who created the world, govern it through his divine laws. And everything is understood in the context of this spiritual being, relation with the spiritual being. So, of course, we cannot defy the fact that our Christian faith has its Judaistic roots. Okay? So based on its Judaistic roots, Christianity teaches that there's only one God, no other God but Yahweh, the Creator, the giver of life, and the one that sustains all of that which he created. So God is at the center of human existence and of human life. But he's not just a God who created the world and then abandoned it. because this God is a personal God. He enters into a relationship with his creation, especially with people. He communicates with his people. He gives them protection and guidance. And because God created, sustained, and protected and guided man, of course, this supreme being, God, demands worship and obedience. Okay? So in such a tradition, there's no separation between the religious or spiritual dimension and the secular world. Everything really is integrated into this whole religious and spiritual dimension or spiritual understanding of reality. That's a theocentric understanding of reality. And that is the character of the general character of medieval philosophy. Everything is understood in terms of the theos, in terms of God. Okay? So, life always takes on a religious meaning. Because we cannot deny the fact that the Muslims, like the Jews and the Christians, believe in one unique and incomparable God, whom the Muslims address to be Allah. So, like our scriptures, the Quran asserts that Allah is omnipotent, omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, and that he has existed and will always exist, and the entire cosmos of created beings depend on him and him alone for its existence. So this Judeo-Christian Islamic perspective of the world characterized the medieval, the character of medieval philosophy. I have to add here the Muslims, because sometimes we always think of the medieval as purely Christians. Yes, we recognize that, yes, the dominant thinkers were Christians, but we cannot deny the fact that there were Arab thinkers who contributed significantly to the development of medieval philosophy, especially scholastic philosophy. Okay? St. Thomas Aquinas, in fact, drew significant influences from Avicenna. So we have to recognize the contribution of these Muslim or Islamic philosophers. Now, let's focus now on the formation or development of the Christian faith. So we can see here that the development of Christian faith, especially in its earliest stages, is a synthesis of the religious experience and the reflective discourse on such experience. So there is a religious experience of the early Christians, but at the same time, there is a discourse. This discourse is what we call a theology. Okay, a theology on such experience. So there is the spiritual religious experience of the early Christians. Many of them interpreted this experience based on the revelation and scriptures, but at the same time, there is a discourse, okay, a theology. So there are two orders of such faith: the experiential, based on the experiences, the religious experiences of the early Christians, and the theological. Now, the first order, meaning the experiential, consists of direct accounts of secular and religious experiences. There are stories about their faith, how they acquire their faith, or how they practice their faith in their daily lives, in their daily experiences. Okay. So, and then the second consists of the theological theories. This is where the logic comes in, the logical discourses comes in. Theories constructed on the basis of these personal experiential accounts. So in the first order, you can see Christian literature affirms a number of both publicly verifiable historical facts and religious facts, or what writers would call the facts of faith. So what are these religious facts? These are events in the history of Israel as understood and participated in by the prophets, and then later in the life of Jesus, and then accepted by his apostles. So we interpret these events as revelations of God, okay? The revelatory of God. So the testimonies of the prophets and the apostles are interpreted not as formulations of theological doctrine, but as direct expressions of moments of intense religious experience. Okay? So they're not discoursing; they're actually expressing their experiences, direct experiences of the divine. So it's a direct expression of their religious experience. Okay? So, for example, when Saint Paul talks about, I don't know where's that, on what epistle of that, when he was talking, I think it was in the Acts of the Apostle, that Saint Paul uh, uh, told the account of his conversion. Uh, Traveling to Damascus, he was struck by, by light and so on and so forth, and then he heard a voice, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me, and so on. So it is a religious experience. Okay? It is a religious experience. So these are facts of faith. Okay? So the Old Testament and the New Testament are writings on this primary level, recording events that occurred either within the purview of his secular history or within the religious experience. So first by the Jews in the Old Testament, and then by the early Christians, of course by the apostles, and then the early Christians in the New Testament. So although Christianity has emerged into separate sects or branches, there are underlying beliefs that provide the core foundation of the Christian faith. So first is the belief in one God who manifests himself in three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Second is the belief that God is the creator of the universe, and that by divine act and will, he created this universe from nothing. And together with this universe, he created man in his own image and likeness, and assigned to man the task of being the steward of his creation. The third is the belief that although man was created in the image of likeness of God, man sinned against God, first fall. And then fourth is the belief that because of God's omnibenevolence, he sent his Son, Jesus Christ, by divine incarnation, and Christ was incarnated to redeem us from our sinfulness and to reconcile us with God. And then, of course, the fifth is the founding of the Christian church through the apostles, and the church is continually guided and strengthened by the Holy Spirit. And lastly, that the eventual end of human history in the fulfillment of God's purpose for his creation. So these are the basic beliefs, okay, based on religious experiences of the Jews and the early Christians. Okay, so that accounts for the first set of beliefs or set of teachings. Now, the second order of Christian belief consists of theological theories or doctrines that seek to explain these facts of faith and to relate them to one another or to human knowledge in general. And the formulation of these doctrines is essential or essentially a discursive and rational, is discursive and the rational purpose of which is to provide a logical basis and interrelations of these doctrines. So now, from the religious facts, we now enter into a logical discourse, a rational discourse. So therefore, while the beliefs are common to all Christians, there are different theories or doctrines that seek to explain them. And this will somehow explain the doctrinal differences among the many branches or dominions of Christianity. So experientially, we have a common religious experience, but the differences can be traced to how we interpret, how we use logos, rational discourse, to interpret these facts of faith or religious facts based on a common religious experience. And this is where philosophy enters the picture in the rational discourse, in theologizing these early Christian or religious experiences. So, historically, the development of Christianity cannot be separated from its intimate relationship with philosophy. Because although we say it's a theology, it's also a philosophy by the fact that we rely, or the early Christian thinkers relied on logos. Because theology, although it is based on faith, is still rational. Okay, they still have to use philosophy. But of course, philosophy at this point in the history of philosophy, of Christian philosophy, is, so I'll say, it's still an instrument, a tool, a servant, and chile of theology. Okay, so of course, little by little, the contribution or the influence of philosophy would grow significantly, no? So that during the flourishing of scholasticism, we can see that philosophy and theology, okay, the theos and the logos, reason and faith, are more or less at par with each other. But during the early part of Christianity, we still see, especially in Augustine, that understanding is a support to belief. But we can see in St. Thomas that there is now some sort of an equal footing between fides and ratio. Because during our contemporary times, John Paul II would recognize two wings, the two wings of faith and reason. Okay, so the basic doctrines of Christianity are primarily based on the teachings of Christ, who the Christian believe to be the Son of God, and his teachings are also the will of God, or Yahweh, and that the sources of basic Christian doctrines are the scriptures, which are revelatory in character, and the second traditions. And only in the later in the history of Christianity did the early Christians sought for a rational foundation of their Christian faith. So while the main foundation of the Christian beliefs is faith and scriptures, the Christians or Christianity relied heavily on reason, if only to provide a rational foundation for their faith. And it's not just the Christians who made use of philosophy to provide a rational foundation for their faith, because we also see this among the Muslims. Okay, they also wanted to establish or to provide a rational foundation for their Islamic faith. The only difference is that the early Christians relied heavily on Plato, while the Muslims relied heavily on Aristotle. That's why the later Christians would be informed by the writings of the Islamic philosophers who were influenced by Aristotle. So, Now, in relation to philosophy, the development of Christian thought during the Middle Ages or the medieval times can be divided into three periods. First is the period of evangelization, which occupies the entire first century of the Christian era. During this period, Christianity is diffused as a revealed religion and therefore containing truth within itself, having no need of rational justification. So remember, they are just relying on their religious experiences. Many of these experiences are revelatory of God. So there's no need to justify that. The second is the patristic period. The patristic period runs from the beginning of the second century through the 8th century. So that's a long period. And during this period, Christianity was forced to defend itself both from the errors within and from the errors without, meaning the errors within, the heresies, and the errors without, paganism. So they have to defend the faith from heresies and from paganism. And therefore, the early fathers of the church, they worked out the systematization of the dogmas of Christianity. And the third is the scholastic period, which runs from the 9th century up to the 16th century. And here, Christian thought, utilizing Greek speculation, created its own philosophy in harmony with the dogmatic teaching which have been synthesized by the early fathers of the church. So that's the history of the uh, connection of the relationship between revelation, okay, faith, and reason. And, you know, if you read the Fides and Ratio of John Paul II, he traces this, uh, you know, interconnection, how the interconnection between faith and reason evolved through the history of Christianity. It's a very nice presentation of the relationship of faith and reason, of theology and philosophy. Okay. All right. Uh, Now let's go now to the patristic era. This is just very short, so just an overview because we're going to discuss this in details when we discuss Saint Augustine and the other uh, patristic philosophers. So the patristic period extends from the, as we said, 2nd century through the 8th century, and the numerous writers of this age are called, of course, the church fathers or the fathers of the church. That's why it's called the patristic era, from fathers. Okay, so they guided the interpretation of the Christian truth. Now, the fathers of the church were also philosophers. Philosophers in the sense that, well, they used reason in order to interpret the faith. But none of them were overly preoccupied with philosophy, except St. Augustine. So St. Augustine is the main figure in patristic philosophy. Okay? So we easily divide, using St. Augustine as the reference point, we easily divide patristic age into three periods: the pre-Augustinian, the Augustinian, and the post-Augustinian. Okay? So philosophy before St. Augustine, during the time of St. Augustine, and after St. Augustine. Now, what is the basic characteristic of St. Augustine's philosophy? Now, that man needs reason and faith to find the truth. And the truth for him is God. The truth is God. Well, of course, St. Augustine was mainly influenced by Plotinus, Neoplatonic philosopher Plotinus. That's why the philosophy of Augustine is a combination of the Platonic philosophy, Plato's philosophy by way of Plotinus, and the theology of Saint Paul. Okay? Because it was Saint Paul now who was explaining, no, based on his experiences, he was already explaining the Christian faith. So uh, Augustine was led to this conclusion that we need reason and faith by his personal experience. Okay? By his personal experience. Because, well, yes, we have faith, but we need to use reason in order to defend the faith. So he was arguing with, discussing and arguing with the skeptics, no, the skeptic philosophers. Although he was influenced by the Neoplatonist thinkers, okay, but he was also arguing against their skepticism. Okay. Now, another basic characteristics consists of the interiority of Saint Augustine. Okay. He never ceases to look inside his soul, for in the soul he finds the fundamental principles of knowledge. Okay. Introspection. And I think the best expression of this interiority is his confession, the confession, no, of Saint Augustine, which is actually an act of introspection, looking into his own self, uh, talking about talking to God about his life before his conversion and after his conversion when he found God, and that's when he was able to say, "My heart is restless until it rests in thee." But it's a product of a soul searching, a product of introspection. Okay. Now, the question now for Augustine is, how do we reach these principles? We reach these principles by way of illumination, divine illumination, that God illumines. No? So we have to be near the source of light. So who illumines the soul? God. God is the source of light. And the more we are closer to the source of light, the more that our soul or our mind is illumined or enlightened. But how do we gain this spiritual light? Well, we need grace. We need the grace of God so that our mind will, illumine. But how can we attain grace? We need to have faith. Because if we don't have faith, we will never receive the grace of God, and therefore we will never understand the divine beings. But of course, we understand the material objects because we have reason. But in order for us to understand the divine objects, we need divine illumination. So there's a combination between reason and faith. Well, yes, everybody has reason, and therefore everybody can understand material objects with the corporeal light of reason. But in order for us to understand the spiritual objects, we need divine light, the incorporeal light that comes from God, and we can only attain that divine light, divine illumination, because of faith or because of grace, and we can only have the grace if we believe. So generally, that's how Saint Augustine, uh, puts all these things together. Okay. Now, let me now focus on the scholasticism. Okay. I probably will stop here if you have some questions. So I think I have already discussed a lot. So let's just pause for if you have some questions. Any questions, fathers or brothers? If none, then I will just continue. Okay. I don't know if you have some. Okay. I think there's a question from why do most of the medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas and others framework heavily revolve around the principle of causality instead of factual knowledge and historical reality? What makes their thinking designed that way? Okay. Uh, well, that's quite a difficult question. No? Why revolve around the principle of causality instead of factual knowledge and historical reality? Okay, first, uh, they also focus on factual knowledge, okay? Because especially, I'm going to talk of St. Thomas because I think he's the best representatives of these thinkers. St. Thomas relied also on factual knowledge, and by factual knowledge, we mean experience. Okay, he relied also on experience, on factual knowledge, or historical reality. I will interpret that as experience. Okay, basically, that's where we gather the facts, right? But the question is, how do we explain these experiences? How do we come up a with a true knowledge by real knowledge, meaning by a universal knowledge? Because a factual knowledge or historical reality will only be true for this particular, you know, for this particular period or for this particular situation or condition. It's not really knowledge in the sense that it is something that is universal, right? Facts are not universal. Okay, facts are specific, independent, concrete, but you cannot universalize that. No? So, in order for us to gain universal knowledge, we have to employ some principles. Okay, and the question is, what causes these things? What would be a general or universal principle that would allow us to explain everything? I mean, uh, if we're going to use Kant said, well, there are contingent things, but we cannot have a science of particular. Science must something, it has some universal, scientific knowledge must be something that is universal, uh, a priori, right? Absolute, etc., etc. So that's where the principle of causality comes in. Okay. So yes, they may revolve around the principle of causality because you're looking for the either the material cause or the efficient cause or the formal cause, but these causes is the one that ties up, universalizes all the historical facts that makes it universal. So yes, it they revolve around this principle causality, but let's not dismiss that they also make a lot of factual knowledge or experiences. But they need to universalize this, and the principle that is available to them is the principle of causality. Now, in addition to that, if you trace back the philosophies of the scholastics, Aquinas and company, they were heavily influenced by the philosophy of Aristotle. And one of the central concepts of Aristotle is causality. It was Aristotle who distinguished the four causes: material, efficient, formal, and final cause. So that's the kind of philosophy that is available to them, and that would explain why the preference for the principle of causality as a kind of mechanism or principle that would explain factual factual knowledge or historical facts. Okay, I hope I answered your question. Yes. If we try to look at the materials used in the philosophizing, they make use of written texts that have been handed down by their tradition, talks about the wisdom achievement of their culture. Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes, of course, we cannot separate their philosophizing from the written texts that have been handed down to them. And if you look at these written texts handed down to them, most of these are from the Greeks, because of course the when you look at it, the source of this knowledge, of this thinking, are the Greeks. Whether Platonic or Aristotelian, it will always be Greek. Okay, it's just a matter of what texts were available to them during the time of Augustine. The texts that were available to them or to him, the first that he encountered were the Neoplatonic writings, the writings of the Neoplatonists. That was the available text to them. The available text to the Arab thinkers were the works of Aristotle coming from Syria. All right, so it's something contingent. I should say it depends on what is the first book that you read. Okay, so that would explain why our preference for Saint Thomas, because when we entered the seminary, well, the Dominicans presented to us Saint Thomas. So if we studied, for example, in a different seminary, let's say what, I don't know what seminary is not teaching about Saint Thomas. But my point there is that it's contingent to our experience, the kind of philosophy that we encounter. That's the philosophy that will have a great influence on us.
Doc,
Yes, yes, Father Mel.
I've encountered a criticism from contemporary philosophers against medieval and scholastic philo.
Mhm.
They say that given that the conclusion in philosophizing for medieval philosophers is already a given, can we call such a system of thought as a philosophy when it is against the very spirit of a free inquiry that's supposed to characterize philosophy?
Well, in science, if I may use a kind of analogy, in science we have hypotheses, right?
Yes.
And it does not make the scientific investigation as some kind of a fixed investigation
Mhm.
because of the hypothesis. So I would say that what they referred to as already given, I would say for the scholastics as a kind of hypothesis. You still have to rationalize it.
Mhm.
That's if they did not use philosophy and they just relied on their faith, then you can say,
It
well,
could-
it's already given.
Yes.
But the fact that they appropriated philosophy,
Mhm.
the thoughts of the Greeks, it's not the done deal yet.
Mhm.
But from the aspect, from the side of faith, of theology, it's done because it's given.
Mhm.
But you cannot say that in scholasticism as a philosophy because it's not a done deal.
Mhm.
I mean, we can use, for example, yeah, in science, in experiments, we have a hypothesis. Does it mean it's a done deal already because of the hypothesis? It's not.
Mhm.
You still have to perform the process of investigation, and that's what the scholastics did.
Mhm.
Of course, they were guided by their faith,
Mhm.
but are not scientists guided by their faith in their scientific method that they will arrive, that they will be able to validate their hypothesis? It's the same. It's the same, the same application of that principle.
Thank
I
you.
should say. Thank you, sir. Thank you for the question, Father. Other questions? Okay, so let's continue. So I will now discuss, again, just very briefly, scholasticism. So we see in the 11th century a revival of philosophical thought, as as a result of the increasing contact between the different parts of the Western world and the general reawakening of cultural interest that culminated in the Renaissance. So we see the works of Plato, of Aristotle, and the other Greek thinkers were translated by the Arab scholars and brought to the attention of philosophers in the West, in Western Europe. So Muslim, Jewish, and Christian philosophers interpreted and clarified these writings in an effort to reconcile philosophy with religious faith and to provide a rational grounds for their religious beliefs. So their labors established the foundations of scholasticism. But before scholasticism can fully be established, if we go back in history, the beginning of the formation or the development of scholasticism can be traced back to the 9th century, especially to the reign of Charlemagne, the king of France. In 800, he was crowned the Holy Roman Emperor. And what he did was to revive Europe by establishing schools in the palace. We call this the Carolinian Renaissance. Okay? So that is actually the first Renaissance in Europe, not really the 16th century Renaissance. First Renaissance happened way back in the 9th century when Charlemagne established schools. We call this the Palatine schools. That revived the learning in Eastern Europe. Right? So you call that the Carolinian Renaissance. So here in the schools, he developed what would later be the curriculum of the scholastic period, focusing on the trivium and the quadrivium. And of course, with the establishment of the palace schools, of course, the first schools were only available to the aristocrats, but later on, Charlemagne established schools in the rural areas, which actually became the precursors of the universities, of the big universities. No? So 11th century, 12th century, you have now the big universities. Okay, and of course, the works of the Greeks, of Plato, Aristotle, became available to the European, Western European scholars. So that established, or that sort of provided the foundation for scholasticism. Now, what is this scholastic philosophy? What is this scholastic philosophy? Uh, it is hardly a well-tied system. No, it's not really a system. It's the most you can call it. It's a movement in philosophy, because a system would have their well-defined doctrines and concepts, but the scholastics never agreed on something. They talk about the same things, but they differ in their opinions and their positions about these things. They differ about knowledge, they differ about the idea of God, and so on and so forth. So doctrinally, there's nothing common among them, but they share some common characteristics. The first is that they share a common language and method. All these philosophers, all learned men, during the time spoke one language, Latin. And this enables all to collaborate in a common endeavor, despite the differences in the race or in their nationality. The Germans, the French, the Italians, the Spanish, they speak Latin. They also use a common method, which we can consider to be an intellectual and dialectical method, or a deductive method, so to speak. And of course, the best, the basic articulation, or the basic manifestation of the dialectical or deductive method is the syllogism. which was popularized by Aristotle. So um, this method, which disclaimed the oratorical mode, adopted a direct approach to the mind in order to lead it to pure truth itself. So without denying induction, of course, induction is based on experience, and they still have to rely on experience. They showed preference for the syllogism, even presenting experiences in a deductive form. So the syllogism is the basic form of deductive reasoning. So they share that common language, Latin, and common method of deduction. The second is they both assimilated the past. They appropriated the past. They were influenced by the past, and they appropriated that in their philosophy. So Scholasticism is an effort to erect a system of thought based on a rethinking of the Greco-Roman philosophy. But again, as I've said, even though they both labored on a reappropriation or rethinking of the Greco-Roman philosophy, they have different doctrines. Right? So this dependence on the past unified scholastic thought and the adherence of Aristotle. Although not exclusive, Aristotle's philosophy was very dominant. So if the patristic era was more Neoplatonic, scholastic, more Aristotelian. Because there were also scholastics who were quite opposed to the philosophy of Aristotle, although they relied on some of the doctrines of Aristotle, but they were quite adverse to the philosophy of Aristotle. One of such group would be the Franciscans, no? Because the Franciscans, of course, they traced their root to Augustine, and Augustine is Neoplatonic. So this effort of assimilating the past was alive, original, and developed through successive stages, culminated in the 13th century. So the 13th century is the highest point of scholastic philosophy. That's the time of Saint Albert the Great, Bonaventure, and Saint Thomas Aquinas. And then, of course, lastly, of course, the submission to faith. And this trait is the most salient unifying factor in scholasticism. Like in St. Augustine, the other fathers of the church, the scholastic thinkers was at hand, no? To curtail propositions opposed to faith and to correct views and suggest some views and truths for the rational consideration, which, although revealed, were attainable by reason itself. So they have to safeguard the Christian faith. As we have said, they have to battle against errors from within and from without. During the scholastic, even during the golden age of scholasticism, 13th century, they were still battling against heresies and paganism. That explains why St. Thomas, aside from the Summa Theologiae, wrote the Summa Contra Gentiles to present his arguments in purely rational terms. He intended that for the pagans because, of course, we don't share with the pagan our faith, but we share with them our reason. So the best way to address them or to explain to them our Christian faith is through rational demonstration. Okay? So the distinction between the natural and supernatural orders was gradually established with accuracy. And in the 13th century, scholasticism was already an independent philosophy in a science perfect in its own order, but remained subject to faith. And that's why we hear these lines saying that Christian or philosophy is the handmaid of theology. So it's a handmaid of theology. So it's always theology first and then philosophy second. some there is actually an answer to that, about this claim that philosophy is just a handmaid of theology. Uh, yes, philosophy is a handmaid of theology, but the handmaid or the servant is the one who carries the torch. And during the night or in times of darkness, you have you must have the servant who carries the torch to lead the way. Short of saying that during our darkest times, we need the light of reason to lead the way. Because that's the work of the handmaid, to carry the torch so that the master can see the way, the path, clearly, right? Anyway, so that's the character of philosophy during the medieval age. So scholastic thought was less interested in discovering new facts and principles than in demonstrating the truth of existing beliefs. Its method was therefore dialectical or argumentative. An intense concern with the logic of argument led to important developments in logic as well as in theology. Now, this less interest in discovering new facts were actually the basis of criticism against scholasticism during the Renaissance period. And if we have to connect scholastic philosophy with Renaissance, we have Francis Bacon, who wrote the Novum Organum, criticizing, of course, the organon or the instrument of Aristotle, which is mainly based on deductive argument. So he advanced the idea that this new tool, this new logic, this new organon should be based on the inductive method, because it's only through in the inductive method that we will be able to discover new things. Because if we just rely on the deductive method, we will just be able to demonstrate the truth of existing beliefs, but we will not be able to uh, discover new knowledge or new things. Okay, so that's, again, that's the difference between the medieval and the modern period. All right. Now, let me go now to this last part of my discussion about the universities, because this will really be, the universities play a very significant role in the development of scholastic philosophy or medieval philosophy in general. In some of the larger towns where there were many schools, universities were formed. So the university is actually an offshoot, first of the Palatine school and then of the rural schools. Okay? So these schools eventually had their own masters, their heads, the scholastics. And by the way, the term is scholastikos, it's a Greek term, scholastikos, actually means leisure. Yeah, leisure, like what? Like uh, study is a leisure for them, no? Leisure. You can hardly imagine studies now being leisure, especially in this time of pandemic. This is not a leisure, all right? But during their time, study, learning is a form of leisure. And who studied? Well, the aristocrats. They have all the time to study. They have all the time, free time to spend, no, on studying. What happened to the other people? To the, well, the poor and the laborers, they have no time to study, so they just keep on working and working. No leisure time. The aristocrats have plenty of leisure time, and Scholasticus is spent for studying. So studying is a form of leisure. All right. Anyway, so from these schools, you have the masters, and in the larger towns, eventually these schools, they bonded together. Okay. So That's where the university, that's how the university was formed. A university was not itself really a teaching institution. It was an association of masters, each of whom ran his own school. And the schools then is a business. No? So think of school now as a business. Well, it happened way before. Okay. So it's kind of business getting his income from the fees of the students enrolled in his school. So if you have many students, well, uh, you're going to be rich because you will have many students. Of course, there are many different courses or programs offered, but the most famous, the one that really gather more students, would be the law schools and the medical schools. What about in philosophy and theology? Oh no, that's only for those who will study for the priesthood. Okay, so the university approved new masters and set a curriculum to ensure the reputation of the schools of the town in order to attract more students. So it tried to set rents and other prices using the bargaining power with the people. That masters said because of the business of the schools that these schools bring or brought to the town. So uh, you have to maintain a certain reputation for the school. So the government, uh, the university rather approved these masters so that you you protect the image, the reputation of the schools. Now, by the 13th century, universities existed in Naples. The University of Naples was actually established by Frederick II, who happened to be an uncle of Saint Thomas Aquinas. He is the cousin of his father. So established the schools, the University of Naples in Bologna, in Paris, Oxford, in Cologne, almost everywhere. So these big cities, they gathered their schools into one university. So it's like a conglomerate. It's like a corporation. Okay? So the urban schools were the public for the new translation of Greeks and Arab philosophy and science, and in turn, the influx of translation attracted more students to the schools. So if you have more translations, then of course that will attract more students. So the church at first opposed the teaching of Aristotle. In fact, some of the uh, masters in these schools opposed the teaching of the mendicants. No? So the Franciscans and the Dominicans, well, they were barred. It's one of the controversies surrounding the career of Saint Thomas. They were not permitted to teach in the schools or in the universities. So the church at first opposed the teaching of Aristotle, okay? But students' demand prevailed, and soon the universities made Aristotle's works the set text in philosophy. And although the church supervised the universities and the masters and the students were all clerics in the medical sense, teachings was not mainly religious. In fact, the clerics, they teach there, but some of the clerics, they opposed the Franciscans and the Dominicans from teaching in the schools, right? So there's also some kind of politics in teaching the schools. Okay? But the good thing is that these the Dominicans, especially Aquinas and uh, Albert the Great, were already studying Aristotle. Okay, so we can consider they were very popular to the students because they were teaching the philosophy of Aristotle. Okay? So the most flourishing schools were in law and medicine. That's the lucrative faculties. At a time when Paris had over 100 art schools, it had only 8 in theology. Imagine that. No? So how many seminaries do we have as compared to colleges? So the mendicant orders, as we've said, the Dominicans and the Franciscans, would eventually occupy important positions in these universities, especially in theology. But of course, it came without much, uh, much struggle, no? Much opposition against some of the clerics who opposed them taking uh, important positions in theology. So the universities would be, kind of a venue for the propagation of philosophy during the scholastic period. So I will stop there. That's my first lecture. That's my uh, first discussion on this, on medieval philosophy. So if you have some questions, we have some minutes for your questions. Okay. Yeah. If you have, we'll just be until 3:30, no? Because I have actually a meeting at 3:30. So I will just be entertaining maybe two questions, or three questions from, if you have any, please. Okay.
So
Yes,
perhaps you could
yes, Father.
just
Yes, Father.
lightly touch on the reasons why the church first opposed the teachings of Aristotle.
Oh, okay. I think uh, it was more of I think from a historical perspective, it's it's more of a a question of loyalty. I would say the church, if you trace back the early fathers of the church, were heavily influenced by Neoplatonism, and it comes not with bad reason. It comes with good reason why they prefer the philosophy of Plato, although they never encountered the philosophy of Aristotle before. But the philosophy of Plato, we could say, fit the theology of the early fathers of the church, especially of Saint Augustine, because I would say Saint Augustine really uh, transformed, or he really formed the early Christian philosophy. It's like this: you have the theology of Paul saying that, well, we're created by God, we fall from grace, by God's grace, we can go back. So it admits two kingdoms. You have the kingdom of God and the kingdom of man. That is from the theology, from Christian theology. What about Plato? Plato talks about the two world theory. Okay, the world of ideas, the perfect world, and this physical material world. And that two world theory of Plato fits perfectly well to the two kingdom idea of the church. And Plato also said that the soul came from that world, expelled, but he can regain, no? He can go back to that world by way of knowledge. Now, for Augustine, that's a perfect explanation for the Christian doctrines. The perfect world of Plato, the world of forms of Plato, is the kingdom of God. In this physical world, which happens to be a copy, is the kingdom of man. God or man came from that world, he is here, and he will go back there. So that's a justified preference for the Platonic philosophy, even though they have not encountered yet at that point, maybe not substantially, the philosophy of Aristotle. So it was more of a loyalty to that tradition. And then here comes the philosophy of Aristotle. And it's coming by way of the Arabs. And we know the relationship between the early Christians at the time and the Arabs. So you don't want to tarnish your philosophy with a philosophy coming from your enemy. That's why the study of Aristotelian philosophy, the introduction of Aristotelian philosophy during the time was rather controversial, because why would you study Aristotle? I don't know if it was Saint Bonaventure who said that the followers of Aristotle were followers of darkness. I'm not very sure of that, but there's a statement to that effect. And in fact, many of the works of Saint Thomas Aquinas after his death were condemned because he taught Aristotle's philosophy. So for me, it was more of a loyalty to this tradition, but that loyalty to the tradition, of course, is justified. So it was more of a preference for this tradition. Of course, Saint Thomas said, well, the reason why he studied Aristotle, because he can find truth in there, and that's actually one of the objectives, one of the goals of Saint Thomas: search the truth. And for him, he would search the truth from anywhere where he could find the truth, and that led him to Aristotle. Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Father. Any other question? I hope I hope you are also taking down notes. No, while you have the copy of my handout, and you will have a copy of this recording, but it's good to take down some notes. That's the student in me talking to you. Because, during my student years, I really write a lot. We don't have a recording like this, and our professors never give us his notes. That's a trade secret. You don't get the notes of your professor, so you have to keep on writing and copying. Anyway, so other questions? No more? If you have questions, you can use the raise hand. No, so I can recognize you. There's a raise hand here at the bottom of the screen. Okay, so I think you had enough. Have enough of the discussion. So maybe we can call it a day. And oh yeah, Hendrik, go ahead.
Doc, I just want to know because, correct me if I'm wrong, during the time of Aquinas, the available materials uh, uh, were that of Aristotle through the Arabs.
Yep.
So is it fair enough to ask if what Aquinas got was the real works of Aristotle, or there are new ideas that were added through these Arab thinkers also?
Well, while the early works of Aristotle were coming from the Arab, eventually they got hold of the text of Aristotle. And what Saint Thomas did, because he did not, he doesn't read Greek, he actually asked his Dominican brothers, I forgot the name, two Dominican brothers, to translate the Greek text to Latin for him. So he got hold, of course, of the text of Aristotle. Of course, he also Because if you study St. Thomas, he was a very prolific reader. No? You read the Summa and he's quoting from everywhere. He got hold, of course, of the many of the works of Aristotle because he actually wrote commentaries on the works of Aristotle, on especially on the metaphysics of Aristotle. So he got hold of the original text, but these are Latin translations of the original text because he never read. Maybe he can read Greek, but he does not have that. He does not does not have a mastery of the Greek language. That's why he asked his Dominican brothers who are experts in Greek to translate the works for him. So that's become the basis of his commentaries on the works of Aristotle. So he wrote commentaries on many of the works of Aristotle. Of course, he also read the Arab commentaries and even the other commentaries, the Greek commentaries of the works of Aristotle. Yung pag tinignan niyo yung Summa, di ba? There's so many quotations from many different sources, and it's easy to know that he's quoting from Aristotle because he just mentioned the philosopher said, and that means Aristotle. And of course, in the Summa, you will see there the objections and the replies coming from different sources. Objection from these writers, from this master, and then reply from this master, and so on and so forth. So he's a voracious reader.
I was just curious about why the medieval philosophy and its thinkers make use of the disputatio as the method of inquiry, and while not the other methods available, or is it the only thing that is somehow circulating during their time? When in
But
fact, in some modern philosophers, especially Francis Bacon, dislike disputatio because of because for him it is quarrelsome. That
yeah,
is why it's a very why does medieval or scholastics were fan of this method as an inquiry for truth?
I don't know, but you are right in saying that that's the practice of the time. No, in fact, one type of works of the medieval thinkers were the disputed questions, where they will argue one particular topic. So it's a court. It's back and forth answer. No, Thomas Aquinas and Bonaventure engaged in this open public debate exchange of. I think that's how they settle issues. I mean, the debate. Even in the classes, there is disputatio. No? So there's the lectio and there's disputatio. And I think for them, that's the more fun way of learning. It's boring to listen to a lecture.
How does it differ to the rhetoric of the Greeks in the ancient? Sir.
I would say the rhetoric of the Greeks was more animated. It was more conversational because I think I'm speaking based on my experience. When I attended the World Congress in Philosophy in Athens in 2013, it's my first-hand experience of listening to the Greeks discussing. They can discuss endlessly. Yeah, right. Oh my goodness. We had a session. Normally in a conference, we end the session at around 6 in the evening, right? Because we go home, or if it is an in-house or live-in seminar, for example, you stay in one place, then maybe the discussion will be until 8 o'clock, and then you have dinner, and then you rest. We have a session after dinner, and the session started at around 9 p.m. And we were thinking, the foreigners were thinking, well, maybe people are already tired after the presentation. There will be no questions. So we'll just be, retiring to our rooms. And then after the presentation, there was a moment of silence, and then somebody, a Greek guy, stood up and asked question. I thought, or we thought, the foreigners, thought, well, maybe it's just a matter of courtesy. You have to ask some questions to the speaker. And then somebody answered, and then somebody answered back, and then it's a full-blown discussion, and they ended up already 11 p.m. just discussing, just talking. But it was more of a conversational, really. No, so the Greek, as compared to the Latin or to the, it was more conversational. You can imagine the dialogues of Plato. It was more of a conversation. But it was flattened after that, but only this time it was very rigorous. Okay, the scholastics are very rigorous, and you can see that in the Summa of Saint Thomas. You have the very structured, as if two people are talking. You have the objection, then you apply objection, reply. But it's not a very natural thing, of course. No, the more natural thing is the dialogue of Plato. So I would say that's the practice of the time, and I think that's more enjoyable for them. Of course, not for us. Yes, Father Surin.
So very briefly, just to follow up from Brother Jess' question, is it safe then to assume that the art of rhetorics is part of disputatio because it relies on the fact of the ability to convince the other of my answer?
Oh yes, yes.
Okay.
It's not just to argue your point, but to convince your opponent or the other side of your argument. And Saint Thomas, as we will see, is a master of this. It's a master of the disputation. But the reason for that is Saint Thomas studied both sides.
Hmm.
So he knows the argument of the other side. And it's not just always winning the other side, but coming up with a synthesis, the middle ground. And that's one quality of the philosophy or the philosophizing of Saint Thomas. As a commentator, he always advocated, he always wanted to have a kind of intellectual rapport with his audience and come up with a synthesis. That's how he ends the discussion in the Summa, right? It's not just winning this, winning that, but coming up with a common ground.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Wonderful.
Thank you, sir.
All right. So other questions? If none, then maybe we can call it a day. No? So let us pray. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen.
Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you, brothers and fathers. See you next week.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.